Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. And if you're enjoying the conversations here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you or anyone else you know would like to be on the show to have a conversation with me, be sure to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle there is Isaac R. Levin, or you can reach out to me on Mastodon. My handle there is Isaac R. Levin at fossadon.org. All right, so that out of the way, I'm looking forward to this conversation. One, because I'm a bit selfish and I act like I know a lot about Kubernetes, but I really don't. And I got somebody who's a Kubernetes expert on the show, right? And we can just learn about Kubernetes and how it helps the developer ecosystem. So my guest today is Lukas Gentele. Lukas, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi Isaac. Thank you so much for inviting me to the show. Yeah, great to be here. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of Loft Labs. Uh, People know us best by our open source project vCluster, and
Mm-hmm.
most recently we actually launched another one called DevPod. And yeah, super excited to have the conversation with you today.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it for a couple of reasons why I mentioned. Like, I'm hoping to, you know, maybe there needs to be a door needs to be unlocked in my brain for like Kubernetes and all the sort of great things that you can get from a cloud native perspective with with all of that tooling. But before we get started down that path, I'd love to figure out how you got started. Like, do you recognize or remember a time in your life when technology first introduced itself to you and you were very much like, this is it, this is the thing that I want to do?
Yeah, I think I started programming with like 13 or something like
Oh,
that,
okay.
pretty early days. So I just kind of tinkering around was a lot of like web technologies kind
Yep.
of got me hooked, right? And building my own little website, and it was just kind of fun. And in high school, I guess I had that the entrepreneurial spirit in me from the start. I was maintaining my own little website, and then our school site in high school was really crappy. It was like from the 90s,
Sure.
like early
Yeah.
90s.
Yeah.
It was like one HTML page, I think, and then a couple of static links or something like that. And I just redid it and went to a teacher and said like, hey, how about, we launched this new site. He was like really ecstatic about it and put it up there. And a couple of local businesses saw that, and they obviously you send your kid there, and then you're like checking out the school website, and they were kind of asking like, hey, who did that website? I need some website for my doctor's office or whatever,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I seized that opportunity and got started. So I think I started my first business around when I was 16.
Oh, wow.
And that was like this kind of website building business, and then I did more online shops later on. And yeah, it's actually funny because I grew up in Germany, and in Germany you can't just start a business when you're underage. It's not allowed.
Oh,
Like
like at all. Like, sure. Yeah. Can
not at
you're allowed to
all.
work
No.
when you're allowed to work when you're under 18, but you just can't run a business.
Yeah, you
Sure.
can do like internships and stuff, but like starting a business is a lot of, liability and stuff
Sure.
like that, right? And yeah, it's funny because like I read up on this stuff, and it's super layman, obviously, right? And yeah, I think you kind of have to open up this court procedure on yourself to kind of prove in front of a judge that you should be allowed to take on that liability.
Okay.
And then
That's
ultimately, if you win the case on yourself, they allow you to open the business, and they're like, congratulations, you can open this business, but you can also go to prison like an adult now. And I was like, okay,
yeah.
I'm not so sure about that part,
I don't
but
know about the going to prison
yeah.
thing. That sounds like a bit, especially if you're 16. I don't think going to prison sounds very exciting. So what
Yeah,
was
yeah. I
like?
think they want to scare you a little bit of
Sure.
like,
Sure.
don't screw up and do something stupid.
Yeah, I think also they want to deter people, right? Like, oh, do you really want to do this? Like, because the risk is going to jail, which I don't think. Yeah, I think it's a pretty easy way to just make sure people aren't interested in doing something. Um,
Yeah,
so
for sure.
do you remember the first program you wrote? I'm always curious about this because you mentioned you were doing the
Um,
web stuff, right? Like my introduction to tech was building on the web, and it's like that immediate satisfaction of like, oh, I make a small change and a box moves from here to here. Do you remember like the first thing that you built?
it must have been something with JavaScript. It must
Sure.
have been some browser-based stuff. But no, I don't think I remember. I think I had I built a little bit of a guest book on
Mm.
my website was a thing back then, right?
Yeah,
You had
yeah,
a
yeah.
personal website and you had the guest book where people could like leave a comment and say
Sure.
hi or
Yeah,
something
yeah.
like that. Yeah, I think that's probably that must have been the first one.
Yeah, like the I like to call it the pure days of the web, right? Like I think that it's funny because you think about all the things. I think I'm from a similar age as you, where it's like you could do MySpace pages and you can do like GeoCities and you can do like all this cool like web development, and it was all very harmless, right? Like it didn't seem like everything that you're doing a million people had eyes on, like, and now like you build anything and there's 1,000 people coming out of nowhere that are very much just like, oh, like you should be using let instead of var, right? Or whatever like the random thing is. So okay, so when did you realize that it was? So you said that you went to, like they started to like look into getting a bit like start a business, like, so you obviously realized pretty quickly that there was like a career and money to be made in tech, right?
Yeah, I mean, these folks just were like, "Hey, I'll give you $300 if you build me a website, right?" And it's like, "But you got to send me an invoice." And I think that's how it started. I was like, "Okay,
Oh
I got to send
yeah,
an invoice. How do
yeah,
I do that,
yeah.
right?"
Like what's your
And you just
yeah.
start
I
Googling.
don't know how like the business setup in Germany is, but it's like, oh, what's your tax number? What's your like, yeah, you
Right,
should,
exactly.
yeah, you
And I was
talk.
like, I don't have any of that.
No, yeah, yeah. It's like,
I have no
can't you
idea.
just like give me cash? Like that would be great. Like I'll take some cash.
Yeah.
So
I think the first guy I spoke with was actually a lawyer. That was and I guess probably, that would have probably been the worst person to have as a first
yeah,
customer.
yeah,
But it did point me in the direction of like, do things the right way.
sure, sure. Yeah, I'd imagine too, like, you know, he was probably very much just like, I just need somebody to do this work. And then you realized, oh, like I need all these prerequisites. And he doesn't care because, like, it's funny because he was probably able to separate the fact that, like, he was probably asking you to do something that wasn't 100% legal unless you had these particular constraints. But he also was a client that needed something done, right? Which is
For
always
sure.
an interesting paradigm. People are able to kind of escape like what their some of their core like things that they think of on a day-to-day basis, like because they need to get some work done, right? It's pretty fascinating. And that's, I mean, the story would have been much better, not for you, but like to tell. It's like, oh, you like he hired you on as a webmaster and you built a website and he was just giving you cash under the table and he's a lawyer. Much better story, but probably not as ethical. So so with that, right? Like I think you're pretty like deeply entrenched in like, okay, I'm gonna make a career out of tech, like even before university. So I imagine you went to university, so like it was all like computer science. I'm going to do something along the lines with tech, right? So what was your college experience like since you already had like your choice made about what you wanted to do?
Yeah, that was really interesting. Like picking the right college even, right?
Yeah,
Because like I think there's obviously colleges that are super heavy on computer science, but I was also interested in the business part of things, right?
yeah,
Because I got in touch with that so early, right? I wasn't just like interning somewhere and writing code. I was also sending out invoices and like,
sure.
filling out text forms
Hmm.
like super early, right? And I was like, okay, maybe I need that kind of background as well. So I found a degree that's kind of a mix between computer science and then some kind of business
Hmm.
administration management
Yeah.
kind of split between the two. It's called information
Yes.
systems,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think that was really interesting because you had like obviously the deep computer science courses which you could nerd out on, right?
Sure.
But then you got this whole other world to explore as well, and I think that was pretty exciting. And yeah, every good engineer I met in college, I tried to hire them.
Sure. Sure.
Ultimately, I was like, "Hey, you should, join me, and like we should do this together." And yeah, I think that's kind of how did this like, hey, me programming and building some, small website and online shops turned into some more of like, let's go out and find fun custom software projects where we can really, show us a skill and run these projects for these like mid-sized kind of companies and do more exciting stuff. And that's how we got in touch with like Docker, and then
Yeah.
obviously when Kubernetes came out, right? We just did projects with this kind of tech stack because we thought it was exciting.
Yeah.
Honestly, it sometimes was overblown for these kind of projects
Sure.
in retrospect, right? A simpler kind of solution like Heroku would have done it for some of these projects,
Yeah, I want to get into all of that it later on. Like I think there's the whole conversation to be had about when not to use Kubernetes, right? Um, I want to finish up this conversation about like your time in school. Like, so I got an information systems degree too, and I think part of the reason why it was so interesting to me is like I like the idea of solving problems, right? And whenever I had like computer science curriculum, it was all very academic and very theoretical, right? Like I'll be the first one to like not like if anybody's heard this show, they're like, oh, Isaac's gonna go into the rant about big O notation, right? Um, but like I'm genuinely curious as to like what your experience was. Like, did you go to school in Germany or did you do it in the States?
No, it was in
In
Germany,
Germany.
University of
Yeah, yeah.
Mannheim.
Okay, so I'm curious about like your curriculum in Germany about learning it around tech, right? Because in the US, if you get a computer science degree, a lot of it is, very geared towards the area of focus is related to research. If you get a computer science degree,
Mm.
not to say that you can't get an engineering job out of school, but like they
Yeah,
teach you like data structures. They teach you there's a lot of math involved.
yeah,
You're learning to do things in C that like people were doing like in the 80s with C. Like you're like that. At least that was my experience. And on the
yeah.
information system side, it was like, okay, this is how you like design a database schema. This is
Mhm.
how you develop like this is the building blocks to put together like system architectures and things like that. And
Mhm.
that resonated very very much more with me because it's okay. How do I take these computer problems, these computer technology concepts, and plug them into like how businesses can leverage technology to be more effective? Was that your similar experience too, or was it a little bit different?
Yeah, no, it was definitely a mix. I think our university had in the first two semesters, right? The first year, it's like it's 6 semesters, right?
Mm-hmm.
3-year degree. It's typically they try to weed out people as well. And I think they do that with all this like highly theoretical stuff. So like
Sure.
lots of math as well, right? Like prove out why, this and this, right? And then mathematical kind of proof. That's how it started, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, what did I get myself into?"
Yeah.
Right? I
Yeah.
mean, it was interesting because it was such a different world from school math, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's super theoretical, right? It has nothing to do with anything I do today, obviously today. But then, as you got further in the degree, I think it became more interesting.
Yeah.
So I think algorithms and data structures. That's still more practical, like traveling salesman and like these kind of
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
algorithms. It's getting closer. It's still not. It's not pure math anymore, right?
Yeah.
It's getting closer. But then what you said in terms of like databases and how do they work under the hood and file systems and CPU architecture and like those kind of things, and then like system architecture. And it just kind of grows from
Yeah.
there. So I took more pleasure the further I got into the degree because, yeah, that's obviously the more actionable
Yeah.
things that you can actually build applications with.
Yeah, I have a friend of mine, Scott Hanselman, who friend of the show, has been on the show, and he talks about this a lot. Where it's like there are some people that like to drive stick. There's some people that like to drive stick shift. There's some people that like to assemble engines, and there's some people who just want to get an Uber. Or before we got started, we were talking about taking the train, and you don't even own a car, right? Um,
But
and like depending on which level of interest is, you kind of plug yourself into that layer. And below you and underneath you, there are different levels. And the higher you get up, the more abstracted you are from whatever. And I think we live in a world now where the level of abstraction for a lot of this stuff is so high. I was reading an article about how whatever the latest generation is that generate not is it Gen Z is the newest one or the one after Gen Z that
I think Gen Alpha,
yeah,
right?
Gen
That's the
Alpha.
newest.
It about and how he was comparing like computer literacy between Gen Alpha and other generations. And
Mm.
like there was this comment in the article from a teacher that was like, I would equate, I have a grandparent who's like a boomer, like born in the 50s, born in the 40s, whatever. And my students' tech literacy is pretty close to what my grandparents is. And I think about that
Mm.
because if you're 14, 15, and your entire interaction with technology has been on an iPhone and Wi-Fi or cell or 4G or 5G, you don't know anything about computing because
Mhm.
you're in that ecosystem, right? And
Yeah.
I'm genuinely curious, like over the next 10 years, if we're going to kind of have this cycle of like people not knowing anything about tech, like people not knowing like how to like troubleshoot, like if Windows stops working or if Mac OS stops
Yeah.
working,
I
right?
mean, we've all heard the term prompt engineer, right?
Yeah. Well, so we can talk about that too. I think that there's a whole nother level of like replacing the user experience with just a chat box, right? Like it's funny that Google did that, 20 years ago with Google with the search algorithm, with the whole search idea, right? But now we're getting to this point where it's like, okay, don't give me a list of results, give me an answer, a definitive answer, right? Okay,
Yeah.
so that was a whole little diatribe. I apologize, but like I'm so, you know, when did you? So obviously you mentioned you had this entrepreneurial spirit. So when you finished up university, were you very much like, I want to start a business? I have all of these ideas that I want to see into fruition, or did you go down the path of like, I'd like to make some money first and then do that?
Yeah, I think I think really the start of all of this was we built this internal tool called DevSpace
Mm-hmm. Yep.
for working with Kubernetes, and we put it on GitHub. And that was the first time really, and that was towards the end of my degree. I was still in
Oh,
college
okay.
at that time, or I was just getting out, I think, like that around that time, right? And it was really interesting because we used it to kind of develop ourselves on top of Kubernetes. I think that just made us more productive, and we open source it. We put it on GitHub. We had no idea about like how open source works or any of this, right? Um, but it was amazing to see how much feedback you get so
Sure.
quickly and how people just kind of pick it up. You put it on Reddit, and then you're surprised, like, oh, like there's a Kubernetes maintainer taking interest in this and
Yeah.
like getting back, and like, someone from Red Hat puts it in a newsletter, and you're
Also,
like, oh my gosh, this is great,
also
right?
very dangerous to put anything on Reddit and ask for feedback, right? Like,
That's true,
um,
right?
so, um, so I'm going to just take a like. So, can you explain a little bit about what dev space is? It's like, so if for maybe somebody who's listening to this who maybe knows a little bit about Kubernetes, maybe understands what Kubernetes is to an extent, but doesn't really might not understand how dev space can play into that entire ecosystem from a tooling perspective. Do you want to talk a little bit about what dev space is?
Yeah, yeah. When we did a lot of these, custom software development projects, with the other students that I hired, we started working with Kubernetes. Like this was like 2017 or so,
Mm-hmm.
and Kubernetes was really this like sysadmin tool,
Yep. Yeah.
rather than it was really like ops world, right? It wasn't really super accessible for
Yeah.
developers, right? Um, and we built stuff to run on Kubernetes though, and we were kind of like, well, shouldn't we, like build it on Kubernetes from the start? Because
Yeah.
like we're building a Docker Compose, and then we gotta somehow push it into this. I'm not sure. I think that was Helm version 1 or 2 at the
Sure.
time, right? Into this Helm chart somehow, right? Um, and then that was just a pain, right? And we're like, why don't we start with building it on top of Kubernetes, and like Minikube and like all of this like local Kubernetes experience was also really crappy at the time. It
Sure.
was really difficult standing up a cluster in the first place, right? But then once you had a cluster, like how do you deploy your application
Yeah.
to it? And then how do you make an incremental change? You got to redeploy everything again, right? And that inner loop of development, that's what DevSpace
Yeah.
ultimately tried to solve. There were tools out there. I think Draft was one of the first
Mm-hmm.
ones. I think it's discontinued. Microsoft launched that. And what it did was essentially it had a file watcher on your local file system on a specific folder where your source code was located. And then you told it how to build an image and where the Docker file is located. And it just rebuilt that image, deployed a container where every time you made a file change or
Yeah.
something like that. And we were like, oh, this is pretty slow though.
Sure.
It's like, can we get this faster, right? And that's what DevSpace ultimately did. DevSpace is like you deploy it once, you stand up your Helm chart, and then these incremental changes, like the build artifact, gets injected into the running container.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have to rebuild an image, push it to a registry, pull it in
Yep.
Kubernetes, etc., right? Have all of that mess. you just update the container in real time.
Yeah.
And then you refresh, you can even attach a remote debugger, right? That's what DevSpace really solved for folks. It's really making Kubernetes more accessible for the developers, kind of like a Docker Compose,
Sure.
but for Kubernetes. That was the idea.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, that I think of as you're just defining it is like, okay, if I'm a developer who's currently building out some application set or suite of applications, right? Some microservices, if you want to use that phrase, like the local tooling or the local development is really challenging sometimes, right? Like you need to have Docker on your machine, you have to do all these things, you have to, and it's funny because whenever we talk about Kubernetes in general, we talk about like all the tools that need to come along for the ride with Kubernetes. And I remember
Right.
I had Joe Beat on the show a while ago, one of the co-founders of
Oh,
Kubernetes,
cool.
and he was
Yeah.
very like it's funny because I don't remember if I asked him or not. It's like, do you regret kind of like introducing like something to solve a problem, but with that along came like adding all these additional complexities and problems that needed to be solved because of Kubernetes itself. Because that's how I see it. I think one of the things that's very fascinating to me about Kubernetes is that it's created an entire ecosystem of like software vendors, open source maintainers, just general developers and ops folks like that see all of these edge cases that it doesn't really satisfy for their it doesn't really get satisfied, and they build a tool around it. So like it's
Mhm.
crazy that Kubernetes has like all of this rich ecosystem, all of these things. When you think about like 10 years ago, like it wasn't even a thing really in general. Like I know it's been out for longer than 10 years, but I think really the adoption has really been like in the last 5 or 6 years, probably like at scale.
Yeah, for sure. I think one thing that Kubernetes has done really well that potentially other technologies in the past have not done as good of a job of, like sometimes when open source projects get a lot of traction, and there's, as you said, there's bazillion edge cases and things you can do, right? And then it kind of bloats the project so massively that it becomes super heavyweight, hard to change, right? And I think Kubernetes did the exact opposite. Kubernetes was relatively well functioning from the start, end to end, and then they started pushing things out,
Yeah.
right? Like for example, storage and the whole connection to cloud providers, right? All of that was in tree in the Kubernetes main stream, and then ultimately there have been interfaces designed for storage and for network, right? And it's like that creates the opportunity for people to start a storage company
Yeah.
that fulfills that interface in Kubernetes, right? And I think that kind of created this rich ecosystem. And that's why the Kubernetes, like the CNCF landscape and all of that stuff, there's like so many tools,
Yeah.
which is, obviously partly a challenge in its own, right? To
Yeah.
pick the right kind of set of things to build your infra on top of. But it also really enables to get such a broad applicability for Kubernetes
Mhm.
because it can really fulfill every edge case, right? And that's super, super powerful.
And then comes like the next wave of things too, where it's like professional service built around specifically building like Kubernetes like solutions or building tools for Kubernetes, right? Like, building miscellaneous sidecars or building whatever, right? Like it's just crazy like and again, like the amount of tools and businesses that have been created over the last 10 years solely because of Kubernetes existence is pretty remarkable. Um I think one of the things too that's always really fascinating to me, and you mentioned this a little bit of like, a lot of initially when Kubernetes was less mature, not immature, but just less mature than it is today. It's like a lot of the tasks that were needed for Kubernetes were very like you mentioned ops or platform team specific, right? Um, and it kind of like tickled a brain because we talked about like like with DevOps 15 years ago or 10 years, like even like yeah,
Right.
where it's like okay, so we have all these things that like typically system administrators or operations folk would be responsible for, but the developers need to be able to do some of it. So like this whole new genre or this area of focus, like DevOps or DevOps practitioners or DevOps engineers, whatever you want to call them, were kind of introduced into the landscape where it's like, okay, well, developers, but they know PowerShell, or developers, but they can write really good Bash scripts, right? And now we have Kubernetes where we're building all this great local tooling And now we're getting to this land of like platform engineering, where it's like, okay, you
Hmm.
not only just want to like do DevOps, you then want to do like SRE as well. You want to manage Kubernetes clusters, and now you want to like build tools for other developers to be successful, right? And you think about like these are all things that developers now have to do. And, I'm curious as to your thoughts as like somebody who's been in this space. It's like, what is the healthy balance between what a developer should and should not be doing as in regard to these areas?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult to say, the developer in a company,
Yeah.
because that there's such a spectrum, right? There's people that want to be the frontier
Mm-hmm.
of like and want to dig into these things, and they're very curious, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And they pick up on something, and they just want to go deeper. So you tell them go use this Heroku and it's git push and you're done.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, no, I want to understand, and I want to
Yeah.
tweak this, and I
Yeah.
want to find out what the flows are under the hood, and maybe we can optimize this. When you tell them, oh, this is the limits, and you stay in this confined space, they're not gonna live their full potential, right?
Yeah.
But then there's other folks who are like, hey, I just need to get this stuff done because it's urgent, and I got 3 days, and however we can ship
Sure.
it,
Sure.
we can finish it, right? It always depends on what project you're on and what the team is made of. But I think what a company can do, and I think platform engineering is part of that, that whole trend of platform engineering. I think part of that is to create certain standards of things that are required in the company. Like,
Yeah.
think of things like certain security checkboxes, right? Or, certain networking requirements, right? But then you have golden paths layered on top of that, which provide flexibility. You can wind off of the path, right? Because you believe, like maybe right now, your deployment with Jenkins is the standard,
Mm-hmm.
right? But another team says like, oh, GitOps should be the future, and we want to investigate Argo CD and
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
how all of this works, right? And you want them to be able to explore that direction, because I think that creates a lot of innovation in especially these like large, gigantic
Yeah.
companies, right? And I think that's what platform engineering is about, creating that standardization and golden paths, but allowing people some flexibility
Yeah.
and being able to innovate in there.
The phrase that I hear a lot is like guardrails, right? Like the
Mhm.
ability is like you're building something for a team, but like I mean, I think we've all worked in environments where like kind of IT ran the show, and the things
Mhm.
that you wanted to do as a developer, you didn't have the access to do them because of some IT policy or procurement policy or just whatever, right? And you know, swaying it a little bit where you give developers autonomy to do things, but they still need to follow company rules. Like they just can't go like, mining Bitcoin on machines or whatever like horrible developers do. Like that's a terrible example, but my point is made. Like that you want to like lead them down the path of success, right? But eh, but not limit them and how fast they get there.
Yeah.
Because and I,
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's really terrifying as a developer whenever you start a new job, and I had this experience. I started a job, I like years ago, and like this is just shows you how like high maintenance of a person I am. So first day, like well, not even first day, 'cause it was during COVID, and like I get a MacBook delivered to my house, and I've never owned a Mac in my entire life. I've used like a Mac. I've used like Mac OS like 5 times, and I remember I told my boss like I'm going to be substantially less productive trying to learn how to do things on this Mac than if you were to just let me use a Windows machine. And
Mhm.
company policy is you have to have a Mac. I'm like, okay, so if I log into the Mac once a week and work on it for a few hours, that's okay. And they said, sure, that's okay. So like that shows you like you know I went down this path of like not following the rules, but I knew that I would not be successful or the company would get the most value out of me if I was to basically learn how to use an operating system. Because
Right.
I'm old and I'm cranky and I don't want to learn new things, obviously. Um, but I'm curious too, like one of the things that as we're talking through like this whole evolution of ops and developer stuff, and so one of the things that you mentioned a couple of companies that exist in this space and different tools that exist in this space. And if your job at like you're on a team and it's like, okay, we want to adopt some new practice to, maybe how we build out our developer environments, or how we deploy, like what tools we need. There are so many choices out there that it becomes like this analysis paralysis sort of thing. So, what are some of the things that we can do in tech? Is it a matter of like, you know, I don't want to say like just look at the Gartner Magic Quadrant and like pick the top right box and like use those tools, because that's not the best idea. But also, it's like
Yeah.
it's a full-time job keeping up to date with like all the tools that exist in a certain space. And then if you're a developer that's kind of cross like responsibility, like, okay, I need to know like what all like the best like dev tooling is for this, but I also need to know like what the best CI systems are, and then like I need to know like what all the different cloud providers are doing. Like, what is the balance for that, like as it pertains to like staying current or staying relevant with tools from a developer's perspective?
I think part of that is really enabling people to be at that frontier. Usually, sometimes people think it's like a coordinated effort, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in a lot of cases, even at a big company, it's often like one individual that's like really curious and
Yeah.
digs in and learns everything about something, right?
Yeah.
But I think what's really important is you have to have a way to um, get that knowledge to other people, right? And I think, some people do that with like regular internal kind of show and tells and,
Brown bag sessions, stuff like that. Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
brown bag sessions, exactly. And I think that's really cool because, yeah, a lot of engineers, get excited about a topic to the extent, that despite being actually more on potentially the introvert side, right, that they really want to talk about the
Yeah.
topic,
Yeah.
right? And they're like, yes, obviously, I want to teach everybody what I just learned, right? And I think if you build a culture around that where people can push forward with something in a as you said, within the guardrails, within a safe space, knowing what are our security requirements, and does that fit in, right? And maybe they don't know everything on that end,
Yeah.
but at least they have some awareness on this topic, and then kind of spread that knowledge. I think then some really interesting things can happen. And part of that is the power of open source,
Yeah.
right? I think one of the reasons why I love open source so much is there's just such a discourse in open source. Like some of the even like SaaS tools and stuff like that I sign up for that are closed source, right? Um, the first thing I always look for is where's the feedback button.
Yeah.
It's kind of
Yeah.
like, how can I
Yeah.
tell these people like, hey, I just ran into this, or I just have this idea to make it better. With open source, it's pretty clear, right?
Yeah.
There's this GitHub issue that I did you can open, right? There's usually a Slack or a Discord, right, where you can just ask a question. And I think open source has this inherent nature of like everybody's feedback is welcome and discussion is heavily appreciated, right? And if you can internalize that into your private repositories, your internal flows, right, your internal Slack, etc., right, then I think that's a winning strategy for a lot of folks.
Yeah, you said something that really resonated with me. Like, where's the feedback button, right? Like, you know, I'm very guilty of like if I go to a website and the website just isn't doing it for me. I don't like the user like experience. I don't like the way things flow. Like, I get very disinterested in using that website or that app or that software ever again. I get very turned off by it. And it's safe to say like you can tell a lot from a company by how much effort they put into user experience, right?
Mhm.
Which is so funny because as developers, like we're not user design or user experience experts. We just build whatever's in our brain, right? And we need somebody else to come and help us, saying like, oh, developer, like you probably don't want that button there. You would probably want it up here. Like focus on something else, right? It's so funny that like, developers are tasked with all these different responsibilities, but like there are some things that I think will never change with developers. It's like one of the things is like documentation, testing,
Mhm.
like user experience. Not to say that every developer doesn't like those things, but primarily a majority of developers just want to like write code, want to solve some problem, want to do whatever, right? So all of the intangibles of being a developer aren't as exciting, right?
Mhm.
And one of the things that you were talking about, you said a while ago was the idea of like, some guy or some gal or some person that's on a team, and they're kind of like the one that's very curious, right? And one of the things that I've always seen is like the person that's really curious eventually gets bored and leaves.
Mm,
And what happens with all of that person's knowledge, right? Because,
right.
I think one of the things it's I've seen time and time again is like developer teams really document things very, very well, especially for very complex systems. Because initially, like, okay, we build out the spec for the system, and then like after about 6 or 7 revs of that product, like the internal documentation gets a bit stale and it becomes very tribal knowledge where it's like, okay, go talk to Jerry or go talk to Glenn
Right.
or go talk to Jill or whatever, right? And when those people decide they want to do something else with their career, like the people that are coming in to maintain, they're like, oh no, this is not exciting at all. So I'm generally curious, with all these tools and with the finding the person, like what are some of the things that we can do better in regards to making sure that like the next person that has to look at our code uh, is going to be successful, even though we'll probably never meet them.
Yeah, that is a really big challenge. I think I'm guilty of that too, obviously, right? Who hasn't written code or set up a build system or CI pipeline,
Yeah.
right? Or written a regex, right? To name an even worse
I don't
example,
write
right?
regex anymore. I let
Where
ChatGPT do it. Like I'm just gonna say, like I gave up on writing regexes like a year and a half ago. Like ChatGPT will do it, and then I'll run it through like one of those regex testers that exist online. I'm like, okay, cool.
Oh
Forget
yeah, I
that.
love
Like,
those.
yeah,
Yeah, without those, I
yeah,
would not be able to write any
yeah.
regexes at all. No, but I think, it's not even just like transporting the knowledge to another person, but even to your future self,
Oh
right?
yeah, that's a thing too.
Because like you don't look at this for 6 months and then you're like, oh boy,
Yeah, yeah.
what did I do here?
It's pretty crazy like how quickly we forget things. Like, and I know this is a human problem, but like in tech, like I feel like the like my memory is so short lived. Like I'll look at something I was building like 2 months ago, and I'm like, what was I thinking here? Like even if the like, and I think it might just be like we're very self critical of the things we do. So like if our opinion has changed in any amount of time, like seeing something that we did, we just immediately like, oh, that's gross. But like it is funny. I've not looked at one chunk of code that I've written like 6 months after I wrote it and be like, oh man, that's beautiful. Like I love that. I immediately critique it. I mean like, oh, like
Yeah.
I don't like the variable names, or like I probably should be using some other little data structure here, whatever, right? Um, so I'm curious, like how do you what is the relationship with you have like as somebody who's like built a business, like, what is your relationship with like the things that you did early on when you were building the business? Like, do you see them in a positive way, or do you see them as like, oh, there were so many missed opportunities here?
I mean, I think it's a I think if you were to look back and even today, like if obviously we were, I think, a great company 6 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
But if I look back at, a lot of things we did 6 months ago or shipped 6 months ago, or, if I wouldn't be, you know, seeing the progress until today, I think that means we would be standing still, right? So obviously what we did 6 months ago probably that definitely had some, flaws or, had a lot of area for improvement. And, quite frankly, a lot of the early stuff we built was, quite terrible, right? Like, for
Right.
example, honestly, DevSpace, that was the first like major piece of code we've
Yeah.
written, my co-founder and I, in Golang, right? We've never like we've done a lot of like Java and C and PHP and JavaScript and like all of this stuff, but we've like obviously Kubernetes, Docker was a lot of Go, so we've read the Go and we may have contributed a line, but we've never built like an
Yeah.
actual
Yeah.
like fully fledged
There's
tool,
a big
right?
difference
And
between
we made
like,
so many
yeah,
so many changes,
yeah,
right? I think there's space at version 6, and there's a reason for that. And it's because we're honest about breaking changes and popping up the major version, right? And I think that just kind of shows you sometimes you got to refactor things from the past.
yeah. We've hinted a little bit, for so we've been talking for a while about like the the company that you started, and the place where you're kind of building all these interesting things to add on to the Kubernetes ecosystem. Like, let me just give me like an elevator pitch as to like what your company is, like the problem that you're trying to solve in the space, and a couple of the products that you folks have.
Yeah, the way we kind of phrase it for the company as a whole is really that we're building these building blocks for platform builders,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's a lot of people out there that build platforms on top of Kubernetes, whether it's like a production scale platform or it's an environment to deliver dev and test environments or hand out self-service namespaces to folks, right? A lot of these internal teams that they care about building a platform on top of Kubernetes, and some tools out there, they want to sell you the platform for your company and your team and your business. And I'm not sure if that exists, to be honest.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. So I think we are approaching the world a little differently. We believe that, DevSpace is a great building block for streamlining developer flows with Kubernetes. vCluster is a great building block for the problem of how do I hand out a lot of Kubernetes clusters without handing out a lot of Kubernetes clusters that
Yeah.
are very expensive, running idle all the time, right? And then DevPod, our newest tool, is essentially solving the challenge of how do I hand out infrastructure, whether that's this vCluster I'm creating, this virtual Kubernetes cluster, or whether it's a VM in AWS because somebody needs to have GPUs attached and run some compute on that, right? And we think all of these building blocks can serve as a foundation for what you make out of it for your specific use case, right? That's ultimately why we have multiple open source projects and these different names for these projects, etc.
Yeah.
Under the umbrella term of Loft Labs
Yeah.
as a company.
Yeah. I wanted to talk about. I wanted to ask that specifically, right? Because you have a company that is making products completely in the open, but it seems to me like from looking at a couple of your folks' websites, like the goal very much is to put the product first, not the company first. And I'm curious as to know is like what is some of your thinking around that, right? Like I think if you think about some companies, like it's very much like product X by huge company, right? And like the very
Right.
much the branding is centered around, oh, like this big company has built this thing, you should use it because it's big company's thing. But your approach is very much just like, this is a cool tool, you should use it, by the way it's made by this company.
Yeah, I think, it comes down to the point people don't necessarily want that whole suite of things.
Sure.
They have one specific problem
Yeah.
and they need one specific, it's very much a Linux philosophy, right? Have like one binary or one command for everything and then build on top of that. And Kubernetes is like that too, in a way, right? It's so composable. And I think that's what we're trying to do. Like if you are thinking about how do I hand out Kubernetes to people, and you can hand out namespaces, but they may be too limited for a lot of folks. So you get a lot of requests for, can I get a separate cluster?
Yeah.
And you're like, separate cluster is super expensive.
Yeah.
Do we want to give that to 10,000 engineers now and open the floodgates and then have a lot
Probably
of
not.
like,
Probably not.
you know, idle clusters, running? Yeah, the biggest fleet I've seen is over 3,000, Kubernetes clusters in one single company. And that's just a huge amount of
Yeah.
clusters, right?
Also, probably
And
not all being used like the way that you would expect them to be, right? And they're all spinning up
no, most of
compute,
them, the reality is
right?
they run idle. They
Yeah.
run idle
Yeah.
most of the time, especially, these are like a lot of these clusters are pretty, like you're going to have a couple of large production grade
Yep.
clusters, and Kubernetes really shines there, right? Kubernetes is designed to be a large scale distributed system. It's great at running a 500 node cluster. It's not designed to run a 3 node cluster that
Yeah.
is, 90% just laying around, right? It's
Yeah.
very wasteful, right?
Yeah.
We had this whole journey of going, it was this like pets to kettle, right? So we had the servers as pets,
Hmm.
and we wanted to turn them into cattle by having an orchestrator like Kubernetes to schedule workloads. But now the Kubernetes cluster itself becomes the pet. And it's even worse because the Kubernetes cluster is not just one VM, it's 5 of them.
Well, this has kind of
Right?
been one of my
Um,
my general takes on Kubernetes is that it's a hammer looking for nails, right? Like, it's one of those, like you mentioned, like you said something that I think is very profound. Like, it works great, like the larger the system is, but it becomes really unnecessary the smaller the system is. But like my retort to that is if you're a developer who's building large system, how do you test large system? How
Exactly.
do you build large system locally? How do you do it in lower level environments? Like you're never going to get the scale of production, right? So
Right.
like it's one of those things where it's like there's this crazy like dilemma that we need to take. It's like, do we waste money in making sure that we have an environment that is somewhat similar to production, even though we'll really never use it to that capacity? Or do we just build something and then trust it works in production?
Right. That's exactly why we build vCluster, right? It's the fine balance between you want to give developers the autonomy as if they had the full-blown thing to
Mm-hmm.
themselves, but you actually don't want to give them the full-blown
Yeah,
thing,
sure.
right?
Yeah. And I don't think a lot of
I think
developers
that's the
want the
nice
full
thing.
blown thing either, right? Like developers talk about wanting like unlimited resources and all this, but like you can't find very many developers who like want to be responsible also for making sure that all of that infrastructure is being completely managed in the way that they want. Like they would immediately probably say that's not my job, that's an ops person's job. Because that's the one thing that I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
like developers have a line in the sand. It's like, okay, like once things go over this, I'm not dealing with it. Like this is not my thing. Like once it's deployed, not my problem, right?
Yeah,
Like
no, for sure.
yeah,
I mean, let's take networking, right?
yeah,
Going back to the conversation we had about college. I mean, I had to take a networking class or two as well. And like that was probably the hardest thing for me to
yeah,
understand. And I think a lot of engineers probably feel the same way. Networking is just really hard,
yeah,
right? If you get into it. So if you look at systems like Istio, for example, right? Service mesh, right? Highly distributed networking system. That's just really complex. It's
yeah,
really complex to set up, right? To maintain, to upgrade, right? And do you want to push that burden into folks? Probably not,
yeah.
right? But you want to make that system accessible
Mm-hmm.
and potentially even allow them to change some of the configuration there? Probably, right?
Yeah,
If that is something that would block them from moving forward, right? Because that Istio feature has not been toggled on, right? That's really the difficulty here, right? Or you want to move with the next Istio version, and your platform team has installed this one for you, and that's the agreed upon version. That's really tricky. So with vCluster, I think the interesting thing we do is, the philosophy is you have this larger cluster,
mm-hmm.
and then you install like Istio and Cert Manager and like all of
Yeah,
OPA, right? All of these tools, monitoring, logging into the host cluster. And then you have these vClusters on top, and they can use the underlying cluster's components,
mm-hmm.
but they don't have to.
Ah,
So you can roll your own if you want to break out of that system. If you're saying, I want to move ahead, right, from where we are today. But for 90% of the cases, you're really happy that somebody else set it up
yeah,
for you and you can just use it and develop against it, right? And that creates a really nice boundary between what is the platform team responsible for and what is the engineer responsible for and what is their autonomy
mm-hmm.
within that system, right? The ability to roll your own if you're hitting a limit is really valuable because that's where people get stuck and that's where the conflict comes in. Like, hey, can you upgrade this for me? And then, the other teams is like, oh, please don't upgrade it because we
No, no, no,
require this
no.
older
Yeah,
version,
yeah. We
right?
don't. We need the API that's going away. Please do not upgrade. Right. Um, you mentioned something too that I've always been genuinely curious with. As somebody who is working in this field and does a lot in this field, and quite frankly, like you have created solutions to solve these problems. I'm curious to get your thought. Right. Like we were talking a bit about like the levels of abstraction, right? And how some tools like inject themselves into a particular layer where it's like don't worry about all the way down. Like we got this, whatever. And one of the things I question about a lot of tools like this, not to say your tool specifically or tools that you've built or whatever, but it's like, you know, is it advantageous for developers to put all of their trusts or companies in general to put their trust in tools that say wave their hands like don't worry about these layers down, we got this? Because I think one of the things that I've seen in my career, especially like with Kubernetes, is like once you get down to a particular level, like we were just talking about, like everything turns into a different language, right? For everybody in the conversation. And if the tool doesn't do what you would expect it to do, like the onus is on
Right.
you to figure it out, right? And I'd like to get your
Yeah.
thoughts about that whole dynamic.
Yeah, I think we went back and forth on this as well. I think one of the key design principles for us when we built vCluster was we need to make sure this is a fully compliant Kubernetes cluster.
Mm-hmm.
We need to pass the CNCF has these compliance
Sure.
tests, right? And when you pass them all, you become a certified Kubernetes distro, etc. And obviously all the cloud providers do that, right? EKS, GKE, they have their own flavors of Kubernetes, but they all have that certain, we're checking all of these boxes on the compliance list.
Yeah.
And that guarantees you that a lot of these tools on the landscape, right? These like 1,000+ tools in the Kubernetes ecosystem will probably run on your cluster very smoothly.
Yeah.
And that contract, right, of that API and that interface is super important. So when we designed vCluster, we just needed to make sure it's a compliant cluster. And we are a certified Kubernetes distro. So when people move their applications into a vCluster, that is usually pretty seamless. Like sometimes we even see companies hand out vClusters instead of real clusters, and
Yeah.
the team doesn't even realize
Sure.
that they
Well, I
got a
mean, again,
virtual
like at the
one,
end of the
right?
day, like if a developer can do everything they need to do, they don't really care, right? Like
Right,
developers, they care very, very strongly about the things they care about, but everything else, just give me something that will work for me. Um,
right.
so like the idea is like, okay, we're giving you a virtualized RV cluster versus a regular cluster. Like it doesn't really matter as long as the all the APIs work, all of the the kubectl commands, or the any commands that you want to run, like the dev space commands, whatever they are, they just work. That's cool. Let's just keep going, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's really important. And you don't need to change your uh, tool chain, right?
Yeah.
I think some of the problems, there's some really promising technologies out there, right? Like I think they, sometimes they have too much refactoring effort
Mm-hmm.
attached to them, right? It's like it would be amazing if we would be there, but it's really hard to get there because we actually have to change our code or our deployment mechanism, right? And that makes it a huge burden because who likes to redesign the CI pipeline, right? That's probably not the most fun thing to do, right? So this kind of ability to just kind of swap out that infrastructure piece of that API and guarantee that things should be running smoothly still, I think is really important when designing tools. Because yeah, again, like there's people that want to dig in, and there's always adopters that are willing to go the extra mile for everything,
Yeah.
but by far not everybody thinks like that, and things just want to ultimately you know get their pull request done, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
ultimately
I got
ship
work.
code,
I have
right?
work I have to do. Like just like we were talking about earlier. Like lead me down the path so I can get down the path as fast as possible. Right. Um, I do want to kind of like take kind of a hard switch in conversation because we've been talking a lot about cloud native development and Kubernetes, and um, I really am curious just personally about another product that you folks have that recently just came out, like like DevPod, right? Like I'm curious about it because it's not Kubernetes, it's not cloud native, right?
Right.
Like as in full disclosure, like I have a lot of experience in other cloud-based developer environments, right? Like, and I'm curious to know like what the thought was around with you folks with DevPod, and like and what you think this future is for like cloud developer environments.
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting time for cloud developer environments. I think we're in this, you know, second phase of it, right? There was the early days, I think maybe 2014, 15 or something like that, right? Where there was like Cloud9 that
Yeah.
AWS
Mm-hmm.
ultimately
Mm-hmm.
picked up and integrated. I think that was the first cloud IDE I've ever gotten in touch with.
Yeah.
And then I think there was Code Envy that Red Hat picked up, and coding. I think they had a integration with GitLab at the time, right? None of that kind of led anywhere, to be honest. It wasn't the right time for it. It was a little bit too early, right? But I think today, where we have this different approach with these remote extensions in the IDE,
Mm-hmm.
and the IDE connecting like under the hood, typically via SSH or so, to this remote environment, and you feel like you're still working locally, but your runtime and
Yeah.
your files and everything you're doing actually happens remote. And you kind of just, but it's also not like, it's not like VDI. It's not like you have like a remote screen that's super
Yeah.
slow and weird, right? It feels completely local. And then you open it up in your local browser and you have port forwarding, right? I think that whole experience has gotten so far, in this like, period of like 6, 7, 8 years, right? And we saw that trend, and we obviously saw code spaces, right, come out, and we really liked the experience of the dev container JSON and how
Yeah.
all of this worked, right? But it wasn't open source, right, which was a major bummer. And it kind of locks you statically into this GitHub, Azure, Microsoft kind of like stack, right? Um, but then they open source the spec, right, the dev container JSON, and we looked at that, and they started putting this like one click add a dev container JSON to your repo and stuff like that. And we're like, okay, that spec's going to be everywhere.
Yeah.
Everybody's going to have that spec, right?
Mhm.
Because it's so easy to add, and it is actually a pretty nicely designed spec. It's integrated in VS Code, right? Another obviously Microsoft owned product. And we're like, okay, what if we created something open source, client only, kind of like a Terraform,
Sure.
which allows you to pick your own infra, right? And you're not locked into this kind of SaaS experience, but you are still fully compatible with it because we're using the same file format.
Mhm.
That would be really powerful. And that was the idea behind DevPod. It was really like a weekend project of my CTO. He was like, "Hey, that would be a cool idea. What do you think? Should I
Yeah.
build this?" And I was like, "Sure,
Sure. Why not? Yeah.
if you wanna build this in a couple of days." And he showed me the prototype. It was super cool. And then we put it on Hacker News, and it just kind of went
Yeah.
viral from there. And I'm very excited about the project. It's super early though. We
Yeah.
we do have private beta now for the kind of server side component of it that helps you orchestrate these environments. But right now, there's a lot of focus also on the open source project and just making the desktop experience much, much smoother.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating to me. Like full disclosure, as somebody who, um, I work at I'm a contractor at Microsoft, so I do a lot of work in like the code space, and then Microsoft
Mhm.
has a tool called DevBox, which is kind of like a VDI Windows sort of thing, but in the similar
Mhm.
vein, high performance compute in the cloud. And it's just generally like very fascinating to me as you're talking about a lot of concepts that like as developers like we've struggled with for so much. It's like, okay, how do I get my environment like up and running as fast as possible? How do I get all the tools that I need on my environment without like having to like literally go through and like sudo apt get install blah 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 blah, right?
Right.
There has to be a better way, and like things like devcontainer.json like you're talking about, and like this ephemeral compute that like literally you click a button and within 90 seconds it's up and running, right? It's pretty fascinating. It's crazy to think that like I remember like before it came out, like this whole like suite of tools, and like you said, there's a lot of them. And when it came out, like I immediately was like, why do I need like this? Like I have like a high like this is
Right.
back in the day when everybody had like 20-pound laptops that were like 16 gigs of RAM and like you know,
Yeah.
and it's like my laptop is just as performant as this cloud-based environment. And then I realized like, oh, this is the start. Eventually we're going to get to a point where even like it's cost effective because I don't need a high performance like physical machine anymore. It's accessible because I can do it like you said from a browser with like the remoting extensions, and like it's the reusability too. Like, and where do you like obviously like this space isn't fully mature yet. Like where do you see it
Oh,
going,
for sure.
right? And like then when we talk about wrapping up like the earlier part of our conversation, where we're talking about platform engineering and cloud native development, and now we're talking about cloud-based developer environments. Like what does the future look like in this space? Is like the developer workloads are shifting from like everything needs to be done locally to everything is really done in the cloud. You can still build it locally, but like all of the things that you're dependent on are running in the cloud and in a more efficient way.
Yeah, I think what I'm a big fan of, and I realized that over the past year in particular, since we shipped DevPod and we've seen so many people run with it, is the power of switching back and forth between local and remote.
Yep.
Because obviously being remote all the time is very, very costly, especially when you're thinking, a lot of drive. I think it's a very opportune time for cloud development environments to kind of have this like second, or this kind of rebirth or the second phase, right? Because there's so many applications now that are very data intense and that need a lot of compute and they need like GPUs, right? And like all of this infrastructure that is accessible in the cloud and not so easy to ship in a compact
Sure, yeah.
MacBook, right, or something like that. And I think the drive in the cloud is much more stronger, I think, than it was like 7 or 8 years ago.
Yeah.
But I think there needs to be a balance between this because most of the time, let's be honest, right? We're not running code. We're like introspecting code and
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
writing a test and we're doing something really small. When we actually get it working and we want to now run it on the full data set, right? And want to run it for an hour, right? Like these kind of processes, that's when I need the power.
Yeah.
But the other 6 hours where I was like debugging this error and
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
iterating over this one test, right? I may not need that infrastructure in that moment. And one of the cool things about DevPod is you can have multiple providers. We call them providers, right? You can have an AWS provider, you have Kubernetes as a provider, and then your V clusters in there. Or you can have local host, your just local
Yep.
Docker as a provider, and you can seamlessly switch between them. And I think that's really powerful for engineers to do. One of the things we're looking into as well is how can we proactively nudge them to switch
Yeah.
when they should be using something different,
Sure.
right? Because like obviously you got to be mindful right now and do that yourself
Yeah.
proactively.
Yeah.
But maybe the software can do that for you at a
Yeah.
certain point in time, or we can at least hint at it, right?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
super, super interesting.
I mean, I love the idea of like, hey, you're doing this locally. You probably should be doing it here in the cloud in this particular
Mhm.
case, like a long running task or something that's like, oh, your memory usage is over 75%. Like, do you want to switch to the cloud? Like that would be something
Right. Is your
like,
laptop getting hot?
yeah, like is there an airplane in your house? Like let's just go. Like it's
Right.
that's fascinating to me, like the idea of like helping developers get out of their own way, because I think like one of the things that developers struggle with, and I've said this a few times, is like we're very stuck in our ways in a lot of senses, where it's like I don't want to use this because I've used this my entire career, or I've used this for the last
I
five
mean, that's
years
why we have like 100+ programming languages and IDEs,
That's
right?
true, right? Nothing ever dies in tech. Like it just kind of like goes out of the mainstream, I think, really, right?
Right.
um So, Lucas, this conversation has been great. Like, I just looked at the clock. I'm like, oh, it's been an hour already. That's crazy. Um, this has been awesome. Like, it's been great to get to know, you personally, obviously, how you got started and some of the cool things that you folks are building over at Loft Labs. Like, it seems to me like, you know, you found very quickly, like, I like this idea of like helping developers get to where they need to be. You figured that out very early on, and I congratulate you for getting to the point where it's like, you have this company and you're building products and people are using these products. Like it's not a small feat. So like, I hope you have the opportunity to like sometimes retrospectively be like, oh man, like this is crazy that I got to this point, because I think a lot of us tend to just always look forward, but I think it's really important too to look back.
Yeah, I don't think I would have assumed that I, would have moved to the
Sure.
US,
Yeah.
started this kind of company, raised venture capital. I had no idea what that was when I was 16,
Yeah.
started that website building
Yeah.
business,
Yeah.
right?
It's crazy to think that you almost went to jail and now you run a company, right? Like usually people run
Right.
the company and then go to jail. Like, anyway, that's a stupid joke. But this has been great. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. This has been a, a great amount of fun. I like to kind of, as we wrap up the conversation, like, what are some of the things that you're looking at? We talked for an hour about like these, like it's fairly new things in our industry, right? And when you think about those things, like, the last 10 years of the software industry, and how it's kind of completely transitioned into these new dynamics, like, what are some of the things that you think about if you retrospectively look at think of those sort of things?
That's a good question. I think in the Kubernetes space in particular, there's just so much popping up all the time,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I'm still thinking about, like GitOps and this whole like paradigm of like, hey, pull things into the
Yeah.
cluster rather than
Yeah.
having the CI pipeline push it, right? And like these kind of shifts and whether they, I think sometimes it's interesting because like, functions, for example, right? At a certain point, everything was Lambda, right? And it was like, is it Lambda or is it container, right? And then it was like, maybe it's both because
Yeah.
like functions are great for certain things, and
Yeah.
and I feel like that's always the balance. Whenever somebody comes around and says like, oh, everything needs to be Rust now, right? I'm like, maybe some things should be and others shouldn't, right? I've gotten to
Yeah.
that attitude whenever somebody throws something new at me, I'm like, maybe there's this specific case for it, but maybe not everything needs to be solved by it. And that includes Kubernetes as well, right? Like there's certain things that Kubernetes is just not great at, and other things it really is.
Yeah, no, I mean it's very true that we run into this consistently where we're building something and then we're like, "Oh, do I need this?" Probably not, but I'm going to use it anyway because, a friend told me or I saw like a post on Hacker News about it, right? And then we just spin our wheels trying to like build a solution around the tool instead of using the tools to build the solution, right? So it's pretty
Right.
fascinating that we're in this space and, you know, tools like vCluster and tools like DevPod and even tools like DevSpace, like the goal is to make it a bit simpler and to like into attempt to make the life of a developer a bit better, which I totally am on board with. And if you folks are curious to learn more about what the folks over at Loft Labs are doing or what Lukas is doing, like there'll be links to in the show notes to some of the products we talked about, the Loft Labs website. But you should also be following Lukas on social media, like probably posting all sorts of interesting things. So a great place is Twitter or X, like so you can find them at Lukas Gentele, so LUKASGENTELE. And like I said, there'll be some links to the show notes or some other cool stuff. Before we sign off, my friend, do we have any parting words for everybody?
No, just don't be shy, right?
Don't be shy.
Send me a LinkedIn request
Yeah.
or follow on Twitter or DM on Twitter. I guess you got to be verified for that. I'm not sure what the state out there is today. You'll find me on our Slack channel, of course, right? We have the Slack workspace with channels for each one of our projects, and obviously in the Kubernetes one as well. Like I'm super approachable. Sometimes people are like, hey, should I, reach out or not? Like, just do it, right?
Yeah.
Like, I
It's that
usually
bit it's
try
that
to get back to
it's
everybody.
that CEO title, man. Like people are like, "Oh, do I reach out to the CEO?" It's like, I mean, again, like,
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes they think I'm like just a business guy now, right?
oh,
And I'm like,
well,
no, I can nerd out
you are just the
on
business
everything
guy.
you're
Don't
throwing at
forget,
me.
you are just the business guy. Like, but this conversation has been great, Lukas. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for the folks that are tuning in right now and the folks that are listening in the future. So my name is Isaac Levin. This has been Coffee and Open Source, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.